In May of 2011, the disappearance of Leland Carter, a 27-year-old woman aboard the Ocean Mirage cruise ship, sent shockwaves of fear and panic through the travel industry. What was supposed to be a dream honeymoon quickly spiraled into a chilling mystery that haunted investigators for years. The investigation unearthed shocking truths about her marriage to 32-year-old Brandon Carter, a Miami-based attorney with a dark side. Though they had exchanged vows in a lavish ceremony just months earlier in December 2010, beneath the smiles and champagne toasts, lies and betrayals had already begun to unravel their future. The morning of May 10, 2011, dawned with calmness over the Ocean Mirage. The ship glided smoothly beneath the Caribbean sun, heading toward its next destination, St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands, known for its crystal-clear waters and sun-kissed beaches. As passengers sipped their morning coffee and strolled leisurely along the deck, Suite 7419 stood eerily silent. At 8 a.m., a cabin assistant, tasked with cleaning the rooms, walked down the hallway. He had already tidied several cabins that morning, each one holding the usual traces of a honeymoon, half-unpacked luggage, half-empty champagne bottles, and the faint scent of sunscreen hanging in the air. When he reached Suite 7419, he knocked, expecting at least a groggy response from a newlywed couple. Nothing. He knocked again, louder this time. Still, no answer. The assistant checked his schedule and notes. The suite belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Carter, who had boarded just 4 days earlier in Miami, looking every bit the picture-perfect newlyweds. But rumors had swirled among the crew. Whispers of tension between the couple, of arguments growing louder each night, had begun to spread. At 8:05 a.m., with still no response, the assistant hesitated for a moment before pulling out his access card. He had permission to enter if the guests were not inside, but something about the unsettling silence made him uneasy. When the lock clicked open, and the door swung wide, the assistant froze. The bed was undisturbed, strange, given that even the messiest honeymooners usually left the room in some state of disarray. A pair of women's sandals were overturned by the door, and a half-filled glass of water sat forgotten on the nightstand. But what stopped him in his tracks were the bloody footprints leading from the bathroom to the balcony. The sink bore reddish stains, as though someone had desperately tried to wash their hands. The sliding door to the balcony was wide open, and the morning breeze sent the curtains swaying gently inside. At 8:10 a.m., the assistant stumbled out of the room, his pulse racing. He had worked on cruise ships for years, seen his share of broken glasses and medical emergencies, but nothing like this. His heart pounded in his chest as he rushed down the hallway to find the nearest security officer. By 8:30 a.m., 3 security staff had entered Suite 7419 and began their investigation. The assistant stood quietly in the hallway, watching as their radios crackled with tense chatter. One officer stepped out onto the balcony, peering over the edge. The vast blue ocean stretched below, endless and still. There was no sign of anything. At 8:45 a.m., the ship's intercom crackled, cutting through the morning's peaceful ambience. Attention all passengers, Leland Carter has been reported missing. If anyone has seen her, please immediately report to security. The news sent a chill through the crowd. Some passengers paused mid-bite, their forks frozen in mid-air, while others exchanged uneasy glances, whispers rippling through the crowd. To see if anyone knew what had happened, the search intensified. The Ocean Mirage, a luxury cruise ship carrying thousands of passengers, had suddenly become the backdrop for a terrifying mystery. Now, one of those passengers was gone. Security personnel scoured hallways, restaurants, and open decks. Alerts were printed and distributed, showing Leland Carter's photo, pulled from the ship's database. It didn't take long for Brandon Carter, her husband, to be located. He was sitting alone in the main dining room, sipping black coffee. When the officers approached, they asked, "When was the last time you saw your wife?" At 9:15 a.m., Brandon was escorted back to Suite 7419 for questioning. His demeanor seemed calm at first. He explained that he and Leland had stayed up late the night before, and the last time he saw her was at 1:30 a.m. She had mentioned stepping out for some fresh air before going to bed. He assumed she'd returned and slept through the night. But when he woke up at 6 a.m., she was gone. The investigators noted strange details. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, as if he'd slept in it. He still wore his wedding ring but kept nervously spinning it between his fingers. He ran his hands through his hair and repeatedly said, "I don't understand what's going on." But as security pressed him with more questions, inconsistencies started to surface. When asked about what Leland was wearing when he last saw her, Brandon hesitated. When asked if they had argued that night, he shrugged, saying it had been a normal evening. By 10 a.m., the captain had been notified, and the U.S. Coast Guard was contacted. There was no sign of Leland leaving the ship, so a horrifying thought began to form: had she fallen overboard? At 12:30 p.m., a rescue mission was launched. Search teams deployed boats to scour the waters the ship had passed through the night before. The chances of finding her alive after several hours in the open sea were slim, but they pressed on. By May 12, 2011, 48 hours had passed without any sign of Leland. The authorities ramped up their investigation, and the FBI took over the case. What had once been a missing persons report was now an active investigation. The passengers went from curiosity to concern. What had seemed like a tragic accident was now a topic of whispers in the hallways, conversations at dinner, and private debates in the cabins. Some passengers claimed to have seen Leland drinking alone the night before, while others reported witnessing a heated argument between her and Brandon near the casino bar. It was no longer just a question of whether Leland had fallen into the water. The question now was, had someone pushed her? As the FBI began to interview passengers, a disturbing portrait of Leland's final days began to emerge. She wasn't just a woman on a honeymoon in the Caribbean, she was someone with a growing sense of fear. On her last night alive, she had argued with the one person who knew her story, the man who might have been responsible for her disappearance. Had she fallen, jumped, or was there something far darker at play? The truth would change everything. Leland Carter had always been a woman who lit up a room with her energy. She had a contagious laugh, a unique way of tilting her head when she listened to someone, and a personality that drew people in. She worked as an event planner, a career that matched her extroverted nature and her knack for making everything seem exciting. Brandon Carter, on the other hand, had been different from the start. Intelligent, eloquent, and successful, he exuded an air of confidence that was apparent in every step he took. As an attorney in Miami, he built his career on persuasion and manipulating situations to his advantage. His charisma attracted Leland, and for a time, she believed he was the man she would spend her life with. Their relationship had moved quickly. In December 2010, Brandon proposed during a lavish holiday party, slipping a 2-carat diamond ring onto Leland's finger. She said yes, convinced their love story was one of a kind and destined to last forever. In May 2011, the ocean mirage awaited them for the honeymoon they had planned for months. A 7-day getaway meant to help them forget the world and dive into the start of their new life together. The itinerary was meticulously planned: the Bahamas, Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, places where the ocean seemed endless, the sunsets looked like paintings, and their love was supposed to flourish. But in just a few days, the fantasy began to crack. On May 7, 2011, just 3 days after boarding, rumors began to swirl among the passengers. They noticed a shift in Leland's energy. She was still smiling, still chatting with others, but there was something off about her. Her gaze seemed dull, and the crew began to notice it too: the hesitation before sitting down next to Brandon at dinner, the stiffness in her shoulders when he touched her arm. That same night, at the casino, the first public sign that something was wrong occurred. The guests gathered around the roulette table, the air thick with laughter and excitement. Leland and Brandon were there too, at first just another couple enjoying the night. But then, the atmosphere shifted. Their conversation, once quiet, became tense. Those close by saw Brandon's expression change, first amused, then annoyed, and finally, something darker. Suddenly, Leland's hand shot up and slapped him across the face. The sound rang out over the music, causing gasps and drawing everyone's attention. Brandon froze, his jaw clenched, fists tight. But in a split second, he forced a smile, as if it was all just a joke or a misunderstanding. He leaned in and whispered something in her ear, and although he seemed to regain control, Leland's face was pale, her eyes brimming with tears. She turned and walked away, not looking back. By May 8, 2011, Leland was last seen. Lillian had been alone at the Sunset Bar, staring out at the ocean. Hours passed as she traced the rim of her glass with her fingers, lost in thought. Several passengers approached her, asking if she was okay. She smiled, nodded, but the sadness on her face remained. By then, rumors about the couple were already circulating among the crew. Arguments between married couples were common, but what was happening with the Carters was different. It wasn't just simple disagreements, but something deeper, darker. On May 9, 2011, Lillian's last night, it started like any other. In the VIP lounge, couples danced, glasses clinked, and conversations mixed with the sound of the waves. It was then that Isabel Romero, a 25-year-old Argentine passenger, noticed something strange. She saw Brandon at the bar, but he wasn't alone. With him was a younger woman in a tight dress, laughing. They weren't just talking, they were too close, their bodies leaning in towards each other. The conversation was too intimate for a man on his honeymoon. Brandon placed a hand on the woman's lower back and whispered something in her ear. The woman laughed and touched his arm. To anyone who saw them, they seemed like two people caught in the moment, two people who shouldn't have been together. Isabel wasn't the only one who saw them. Lillian also saw them, somewhere in the crowd. She observed everything in silence. At first, her face showed no reaction, but then her posture changed. Her lips pressed together, and her hands clenched her purse with force. A few hours later, Lillian Carter disappeared. When the Ocean Mirage arrived at St. Thomas, there was no trace of her. The cruise, which was supposed to be a celebration of love, had turned into a nightmare. The crew whispered about the missing woman, and passengers exchanged theories. Investigators began to reconstruct what had really happened during those crucial hours. Lillian Carter had boarded the Ocean Mirage as a wife, as a woman newly married with dreams of the future. It only took 4 days to turn her fairy tale into a horror story. By May 14, 2011, the glamour of the cruise was gone. The soft music in the hallways now sounded unsettling. The crew, once busy serving cocktails and delivering room service, spoke in hushed tones. Passengers, who had arrived seeking a dream vacation, now avoided the lower decks where the investigation was taking place. Lillian Carter was no longer just a missing woman. She had become the center of something much darker. The FBI took control of the case, carefully reviewing the ship's security footage. They knew that somewhere in the maze of hallways and decks of the Ocean Mirage, Lillian's last hours had been recorded. A camera located above the infinity pool, a popular spot for passengers at night, captured a chilling image. At 12:47 a.m. on May 10, 2011, Lillian and Brandon were near the edge of the pool. She was holding a small silver necklace in her hand, her posture stiff, her gestures quick and energetic. She was upset, her emotions evident. Brandon, just a few steps away, had his arms crossed. His expression was unreadable. Some passengers, still awake at that time, remembered seeing Lillian, agitated, with trembling hands and a voice loud enough for those nearby to notice her frustration, though not loud enough to make out her words. At 1:02 a.m., Lillian left the pool area with fast, tense steps. She walked ahead of Brandon, her back straight, her shoulders rigid as if trying to contain her rage. She walked quickly, as if her thoughts were overwhelming her. A minute later, Brandon followed her, but his steps were slower, calculated, filled with a disturbing control. The camera captured the chilling difference between them. One was moving with unrestrained emotion, the other seemed to measure each of his movements. At 1:29 a.m., the door to Suite 7419 opened. The security camera in the hallway caught the silhouette of a person stepping onto the balcony. It was impossible to tell if it was Lillian or Brandon, but the dim light and the slight movement of the curtains obscured the details. The figure remained still for several seconds, as if lost in thought. Then, at 1:36 a.m., the sliding door to the balcony closed. The cleaning staff revealed that between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m., someone had removed the bed sheets. This was highly unusual. No one from the cleaning service had entered the room during that period, and there was no reason for the sheets to disappear. Who had taken them, and why? While the investigators tried to reconstruct what had happened that night, another chilling discovery emerged. Inside Lillian's purse, carefully folded in a side pocket, they found a small handwritten note. It was dated May 8, 2011, just 2 days before her disappearance. In her unmistakable handwriting, Lillian had written words that shocked the detectives. "If something happens to me, tell my sister Gina that she was right. Tell her I discovered the truth about Brandon. Tell her I knew everything." The investigation had changed completely. It was no longer about a missing person, it was now a homicide. As the investigators dug into Brandon Carter's life, his carefully constructed image began to crumble. In the days following his wife's disappearance, he had presented himself as a grieving husband. His statements were measured, his tone controlled, and he insisted that he had no idea what had happened to Lillian, that he had simply gone to sleep, expecting to wake up with her by his side. But when the FBI reviewed his phone records, they found a different story. There were multiple late-night calls to a woman named Amanda Langley, a 28-year-old legal assistant who worked at the same law firm as Brandon in Miami. At first, Amanda claimed that her relationship with Brandon was strictly professional, that they had only worked together on cases, exchanged emails, and nothing more. However, when the investigators reviewed the list of passengers on the Ocean Mirage, Amanda's name appeared. She had booked a solo cruise during the same week Brandon and Lillian were on their honeymoon. When questioned, Amanda tried to downplay it, saying it was just a coincidence, but the FBI didn't believe her. Then came another revelation. For months before his wedding, Brandon had taken out a life insurance policy worth $500,000 in Lillian's name, with him as the sole beneficiary. It wasn't common for a young, healthy woman to have such a high life insurance policy, especially one that benefited only her husband. Now, the investigators had a disturbing theory: Lillian had discovered Brandon's infidelity days before her disappearance. She had confronted him, feeling furious, betrayed, and humiliated. The arguments on the ship had not been trivial, they were the reaction of a woman who realized her dream had been a lie. The money, the lover, the missing sheets, the note in her purse, everything began to paint a much darker picture. Lillian Carter had not just disappeared, she had been eliminated. By May 20, 2011, the illusion of Brandon Carter's innocence had completely crumbled. The investigation had gathered enough evidence, and the truth was no longer just a suspicion, it was undeniable. Brandon Carter was arrested in Miami and charged with first-degree murder. The case moved quickly. In the days leading up to his arrest, the FBI found more inconsistencies in his statements. His phone records linked him to Amanda Langley, and the missing sheets in Suite 7419 told a story he had tried to erase. There were no more excuses or rehearsed defenses to save him. In March 2012, Brandon Carter faced trial in a courtroom filled with spectators. His once impeccable reputation was now stained by suspicion and deceit. The prosecution presented a chilling timeline of betrayal, rage, and a calculated cover-up. They alleged that Lillian discovered the affair during the cruise and confronted Brandon on the night of May 9, 2011. Witness testimonies, security footage, and forensic analysis pointed to a violent confrontation in Suite 7419. Brandon, accustomed to controlling situations, panicked and Lillian threatened to leave him and ruin his reputation. Something inside him broke. According to the evidence, he strangled her in a fit of rage, realizing too late what he had done. Instead of facing the consequences, he tried to erase her existence. The jury didn't believe him. On March 28, 2012, after only 5 hours of deliberation, Brandon Carter was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Amanda Langley was never charged, but her career was ruined. Her relationship with a married man who turned out to be a murderer was enough to destroy her reputation forever. Despite Brandon's conviction, Lillian Carter's body was never found. The investigation suggested that she had been thrown into the ocean in the dead of night, wrapped in the sheets from Suite 7419, sometime between 1:36 a.m. and 3 a.m. Without any direct witnesses or physical remains recovered, the sea became her tomb. The ocean mirage continued to sail, but with a ghost on board. The story of Lillian Carter became a persistent whisper among the crew, a secret never fully buried. Passengers who boarded the cruise after the crime would hear fragments of her story shared between cocktails and elegant dinners. Some claimed that on certain nights, when the ship glided through calm waters, the air carried an inexplicable chill. Others said they had seen a shadow on Deck 7, a figure with long hair, staring out at the sea before disappearing into the darkness. Lillian's family never stopped searching for answers. Her sister, Gina Carter, became a tireless advocate for victims of cruise ship crimes, demanding greater security measures and justice for those who disappeared at sea. Her fight led to changes in the regulations for cruise lines, forcing them to improve security protocols and report incidents with greater transparency. But no change in the law could bring Lillian back. Carter spent the rest of his life behind bars, a man who once had the world in his hands and lost it all in a single night. From prison, he continued to claim his innocence, insisting that Lillian had left of her own free will, but the evidence against him was overwhelming, and the world had already heard his story. For many, there was no doubt, Lillian Carter's honeymoon had been nothing more than a deadly trap. The case became one of the most infamous in the history of cruise ship crimes. Television programs and documentaries reconstructed the events, each adding its own theory about what really happened that night. But in the end, only two people knew the truth. One was behind bars, and the other was lost in the vastness of the ocean. Years passed, but Lillian Carter's story was never forgotten. Her family continued to commemorate her life, holding vigils every year on the anniversary of her disappearance. Friends and loved ones gathered on the beach, lighting candles and throwing flowers into the sea in her honor, hoping that somehow her spirit would find peace. Her sister Gina never stopped seeking justice. Although the case was closed, she appeared on television programs, spoke at conferences about cruise security, and became one of the leading activists for the rights of victims of disappearances at sea. Thanks to her efforts, new regulations were implemented in the cruise industry, requiring vessels to improve surveillance with more security cameras, staff trained to recognize signs of abuse, and stricter protocols for investigating incidents on board. Brandon Carter appealed his sentence several times, but each attempt was rejected. In prison, he tried to rebuild his image by writing letters in which he claimed his innocence and insisted that Lillian had chosen to disappear on her own. Some of those letters were sent to journalists investigating the case, but no one believed his version. Over time, he stopped making headlines, becoming just another name on the list of convicted murderers who would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. His former colleagues at the Miami law firm quickly forgot him, and his family cut off all contact with him. Amanda Langley, for her part, disappeared from the public eye after the trial. She lost her job and moved out of state, trying to leave behind her connection to the tragedy. She never spoke about the case again, and over time her name became a footnote in the story of Lillian Carter. The ocean mirage continued to sail, but those who knew the story of what had happened in Suite 7419 could never see the ship the same way. New crew members listened to the stories told by veteran employees, who spoke in hushed voices about the strange feeling on Deck 7 during quiet nights. Some passengers claimed to have felt a presence in the hallways, a sudden chill when passing near the suite where it all had happened. Stories of inexplicable encounters began to spread among the crew, doors closing by themselves, lights flickering for no reason, the sensation of being watched when alone on deck. Many dismissed it as superstitions or mere coincidences, but others were convinced that Lillian's spirit had never left the ship. As time went on, the notoriety of the case faded. Other crimes took the headlines, new tragedies captured the public's attention, and Lillian Carter's name stopped appearing in the news. But for those who knew her, for those who loved her, her story never faded. Her smile, her infectious laughter, the way she lit up any room she entered, all remained etched in the memory of those who couldn't forget her. For Gina, every wave breaking on the shore was a reminder of her sister, of the injustice of her fate, and of the emptiness her absence left behind. But it was also a reminder of her strength, her courage, and her desire to fight for the truth, even when everything was against her. On nights when the sea was calm and the moon reflected on the surface of the water, some wondered if somewhere deep in the ocean, there were still traces of Lillian Carter. Perhaps a hidden current carried the last echoes of her story, whispers lost in the rhythm of the waves, reminding the world that, although her body was never found, her truth would never be lost. Interested in more real-life murder mysteries? Make sure to like and subscribe to our channel. What sentence would you have given him? Leave me a comment, and I'll read it. Enjoy life, because there's only one. Yours sincerely, Crime Shadows.